Hi everyone and welcome to today's chat. My name is Trinia. I'm a team member here at Understood. And today we're going to be talking about how to use mindfulness to manage strong emotions. And joining us we have one of our Understood teacher fellows, Ashlee Upp. And Ashlee is an elementary school teacher and also uses mindfulness practices in her classroom. Ashlee, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you want to take just a minute to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Absolutely. So my name is Ashlee Upp. I am currently a social emotional learning teacher at Allen Freer Elementary School in Camden, Delaware. I graduated with my undergraduate degree from the University of Delaware in 2009 and spent 5 years teaching second grade and 5 years teaching third grade. I also have my master's degree in educational leadership, and I'm working on my doctorate studying mindfulness in the school setting. I have done training through Mindful Schools and Yoga for Classrooms as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. This is the perfect topic for you to be here with us talking about, so we're so excited to get started. I do want to let our viewers know this chat is a little bit different from the chats that we typically do in that we're pre-recording this chat. So when you're watching this, it is not live. We will not be responding to live questions because we asked our audience in our community on social media to send us their questions ahead of time so that we could ask them to Ashlee and get as many answers as we could. So you'll notice as we're going through the chat that I did combine some people's questions just so we can keep the flow going and answer as many questions as we can. But if you are watching, we'd love to know who's out there, so feel free to go ahead and leave us a comment. Let us know where you're watching from. If your kids have any mindfulness experience in the classroom, or maybe you practice mindfulness at home, we'd love to know. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. And I want to get started by, Ashlee, I want to ask you more about your personal experience because I think that's really going to give us a jumping off point for this conversation, and I think our parents are really going to identify with your story and appreciate hearing more about it. So you bring a very unique perspective to the teaching field in that as a student you struggled with learning and you had your own learning and thinking difference. And so I wanted to start by asking you to talk a little bit about what that experience was like for you as a student, and then how it's affected your teaching practice today.
So I grew up in a family of individuals who really just excelled at life. And when I entered school, by the time I was in second grade, I realized that I wasn't like anybody in my family, and I wasn't like anybody that I went to school with. I would go to the library and I wouldn't be able to read books that my peers could read. I remember having these leveled readers, and they were all in these fancy colors. And once you got through one color, you got to go to the next one. And I wasn't progressing like my classmates. I was being pulled out of the classroom for extra support. And so by the time I hit second and third grade, I really realized that and internalized that a lot. And looking back, that was the first point when I really started to notice that those type of situations really caused me to have anxiety about school, and it really set me up for a lifetime of anxiety, both in settings where I was learning and outside of learning. So when I became a teacher in the classroom, I believe that my experiences really made me more empathetic towards my students' experiences, and it really made me look at how they were dealing with school from not only an academic perspective, but also a social and emotional perspective. And seeing them go through the challenges that I went through, I really knew that I needed to be able to support them in that manner.
Mm-hmm. That's so great to hear your story, and it's so important for students to be able to see teachers that are like them and that have gone through some of the same struggles that they're having. So I'm really glad that you're a teacher and that you're out there supporting our kids. And I'm wondering how this is tied into your mindfulness practice. So can you tell us a little bit about what got you started or interested in learning more about mindfulness and using that in the classroom, and what has that experience been like?
So as I mentioned before, being struggling in school really set me up for a lifetime of anxiety and challenges, both inside of learning environments and outside of learning environments. And when I became a classroom teacher, it really became an urgent charge for me, to make sure that my students weren't going to go down that same path. And I had reached out for assistance, from professionals, and I had never really bought into some of the strategies that they had taught me. And I actually started reading online different school models that incorporated mindfulness into their classroom settings. And as I noticed more and more of my students struggling with these difficulties and these challenges in the classroom, I knew that I had to do something. So reading about them really sparked my interest. And at the time, our Parent-Teacher Association was giving away 2 grants to classroom teachers. And I applied for one with some professional reading material to start a program in my classroom, some yoga mats and some materials to help students. And when I was awarded that grant, it really kind of began into motion, me implementing this into the classroom. And I just became a believer. From the moment that we started, I think I saw a difference not only in my students, but also in myself.
Oh, that's amazing. And can you talk about, I'm curious, how did the kids respond to this new mindfulness practice? Were they, I don't know, were they excited about it, or were some of them kind of not sure about wanting to do it?
Yeah, so in the beginning, I automatically saw the immediate benefits. But of course, different students handle things differently. They were third graders, so they were very conscious about what their peers were thinking and the practices that they were doing. A lot of times with the boys, you would have a lot of giggling and laughter. But almost within the first week, you would start to have kids that would request time to do this in the classroom. It's not something that's normally done. Normally, in a classroom, you're here, you're there, you're rushing around to get things done, and having that moment to kind of slow down in the day really gave them the opportunity to kind of digest everything that we were doing and really look inward so that they could be their best self outward.
Mm-hmm. And was this something that, or maybe you can talk about what it was in the beginning or what it is right now. Is it something that kids practice every day when they're at school? Is it a certain part of the day? What does the setup of this look like?
So it can really look like anything that the teacher wants it to look like. I teach practices to the students, so there are parts that are student guided, but once it becomes a routine in your classroom, it becomes an all the time type of activity. It's more of kind of a way of living rather than a set time. My first year doing it in the classroom, we would do it in the morning. We would have a reset after recess, and then we would also do it in the afternoon. My second year implementing it in the classroom, it was more of a when we needed it, when each individual student needed it. I believe that it should be a really fluid process and be integrated naturally into the way that your day is going, your students' days are going.
Oh, that's great. And can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the students' behavior change? Are they able to manage their emotions better, or did behavior incidences decrease in the classroom?
So behavioral incidences overall definitely decreased. It's really been a way for my students to slow down and really identify their feelings. A lot of times, our little people feel these big feelings and feel these big emotions, but they don't know how to express them outwardly. And it really gives them the opportunity to find space between their feelings and who they are as people and themselves and their actions. So mindfulness is a lot about, instead of having that stimulus and reaction response, there's a stimulus, there's mindfulness, and then a response rather than a reaction. So the first year that I started, I had a student who would get very angry and very frustrated. He also had learning differences, and he would he would be so angry that he couldn't learn in the classroom environment. And I remember one time my assistant principal had him in class, and she said, he went into my office and he just said, I need to take a mindful moment right now. And he got down on the floor and did some of the things that we had talked about in class. And so in the beginning, it's not always that they're able to catch themselves before they have those reactions, but it's something that with practice they're able to use to then calm themselves down, make better choices, and then eventually it does become a way for them to think about their behaviors before.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk about some of the strategies that helped this kid or help other kids to recognize those emotions in themselves and get to that point where they can start to self-regulate or start to identify those feelings and know that they need a mindfulness break? What are some of the strategies you use to help kids start to notice those things?
So in the beginning of the year, I really set up my classroom to have an environment that is safe for everybody. We talk about what comfortable emotions are, what uncomfortable emotions are, how emotions and feelings are a part of being a human. We all experience them. And we use a colored bracelet system in the classroom where if a student comes in and they are feeling a very comfortable emotion, say they're happy, they had a great start to their day, they would put a green bracelet on. And we have yellow, which means that they could be kind of in the middle, and then red means that they're starting their day not on a good foot. That would allow me to check in with them, but it also allows them to think about their feelings and take that moment to think about where they are, and then they could go and self-regulate. And after I taught them a practice, then they would be able to choose what they wanted to do to get back on track.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. I love the bracelet system. That's a great way for teachers to know what's going on in their kids' lives as well, without having to sit down with each one of them when that's sometimes not possible, right? I want to get to some of the questions that our community sent in and asked ahead of time. And we had some questions about anxiety, and you've talked about anxiety already. And our viewers are wondering what techniques can be used that would help kids with anxiety, whether that's social anxiety or school anxiety, anxiety about even going to school. Do you have any recommendations for what teachers or what parents could do mindfulness-wise that might help with anxiety?
Okay, so I think that a lot of times when we think about anxiety and we think about learning and attention differences, automatically associated with ADD and ADHD. And there's a big correspondence between the two, and not always necessarily together. But I believe that mindfulness is really a way to help them work through their fears, and rather than to avoid those fears. So a lot of times when you have anxiety, you come up with strategies that will help you avoid the things that make you worry or make you upset or make you anxious. So mindfulness has been proven to really activate the parts of the brain that manage your emotions. And so it becomes a realization that one can live a meaningful life with those anxious feelings and be able to identify when they're having those feelings. One of the things that I always like to start with is the power of breathing. So there are multiple breathing strategies that you can use, whether it be one of the ones that we teach to our students is called the countdown to calm. So you put up your hand and you breathe in for 5 seconds while you hold up your fingers, and then you count down 5 when you breathe out. Simple things like that they can do within the situation that aren't obtrusive, but it can give them space between what they're feeling, the thoughts that are going through their head, and the specific thing that's causing them anxiety.
Yeah. And I think, like you were saying, a lot of it is about identifying those emotions in the first place. And I struggle with anxiety as well. And I know that for a long time, I didn't realize that the feelings I was having were anxiety. And especially for our younger kids and our teenagers, it's sometimes hard to recognize what those emotions are that you're feeling. And so just being able to be mindful and, as you were talking about, identify the feelings, and then we can start to address them and use these mindfulness strategies. And we even used mindfulness strategies before we did this chat, right? Do a little bit of breathing.
All the time.
Exactly. It can help to reduce that anxious feeling that we have before we're doing something that we're nervous about or that we're unsure about.
Yeah, and another tool that I always use is an intention card. So being able to, if they can identify what causes them to be anxious on the inside, whether through a conversation with a parent or a trusted adult, being able to identify what might be causing their anxiety, and then setting an intention to really kind of eliminate that within the spectrum of what they're experiencing. Being able to check back in with that intention is a really good strategy to help them cope with what they're feeling.
I'm curious, what challenges have you faced in implementing these mindfulness practices in your classroom or in the school or with individual students? Have there been specific challenges that parents and teachers should be aware of so that they can be ready for those?
I think the first challenge is really getting kids to understand why they're doing what they're doing. But if you lay the foundation from the start and explain to them the purpose of mindfulness, it's very helpful. I really think that you can't force this upon kids or adults. It has to be something that is really owned by them. And sometimes that takes a different amount of time for different people. And another challenge that you come across, especially in a public school setting, is thinking about how mindfulness really started from a Buddhist tradition. And although it is completely not based on a religious factor, a lot of times parents and those who are uninformed about mindfulness practices in the current setting will often associate the two. So making sure that parents are informed about what it is and what it looks like in the school and in the classroom setting is really important.
Yeah, you made some really good points there about the challenges teachers might face. But I want to go back to what you said at the beginning about how important it is to introduce the topic to the kids and kind of explain the purpose of it, what it's for, how it's supposed to help them. Just like any other intervention or thing that we want to do with kids, it always helps if they can kind of understand the reasoning behind it. So that's a great idea. And I want to go back to thinking about kids who learn and think differently. And can you talk a little bit about how mindfulness can help these kids and why it might be especially important for them?
Okay. So a lot of times in the classroom setting, as we've mentioned, emotions and feelings are a really big factor in educating everybody, but also those with learning and thinking differences. And so it really allows them the space to hold these feelings based on what they're learning, and also not internalize that those learning and thinking differences are about them. It gives them the space to understand that we all learn differently and that that's okay. But also when we think about differences in how students learn in the classroom, it can give them the opportunity to be more so in the present moment in the classroom. So if they notice that they are thinking about something else, they can draw their attention back to what's taking place right in front of them. So this week in my class, we talked about mindful bodies and how we can quiet our bodies during class time. So we may want to fidget, or we may want to spin around, or we may want to think about what we're having for lunch rather than what's being taught. And teaching them just to kind of quiet their body down and be able to regain focus and put their attention on what they want to put their attention on is a really valuable skill for our students, and especially those with learning and thinking differences.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the differences for mindfulness practice in elementary students versus older kids?
So with elementary students, again, I think it's really important to lay the foundation for them. Practices need to be explicitly taught. So we're going to talk today about breath, and this is the breath that I'm going to teach you. By the time they get into the older grades and they know some of those things, it can be more of something that's incorporated throughout their day. So it doesn't have to be just this time set aside for mindful practice. But it can be something that, they're walking down the hallway in school and they're doing these mindful practices, and it doesn't have to be something that's explicitly taught. So it really depends on someone's level of understanding. We're now in our fifth year, so our fifth graders have had exposure to mindfulness now that entire time. They're able to more so do it throughout the day on their own, whereas the littler students really need to be taught explicitly. They need to be told when to do things. But again, comfort level really plays a big role in that.
I'm sure it probably depends on how long they've been practicing, how much experience they have with that. And that's so cool that this is a school-wide program, that the kids are getting this at every year. That's awesome. But we know that that's not the case in all schools. And I know that we have a lot of families and parents that might be watching this and wondering, well, what can I do with my kid at home if they're not getting this at school and they're not able to practice or they're not being taught mindfulness in the school. So do you have any suggestions for resources or strategies that parents and families can use to help their kids learn these practices?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I love to do is incorporate picture books with our students. So this is a book called I Am Peace, a book of mindfulness, and it introduces kids to the concept of what mindfulness is. There are tons of books that parents can buy and a lot of lists out online. So I highly encourage you, if you Google mindfulness books, a whole array will come up that really introduce some of those topics to students. I also use card decks, and these just have simple practices on them that parents can lead their children through. And it really takes the guesswork out for anybody who is starting out from the ground level. So you don't have to be an expert at doing these things. You just have to be able to be willing to give them a try, to be able to make it work for you and your family. There are also a lot of great trainings that are available online for families and for teachers. So again, I mentioned that I did some online classwork through Mindful Schools, which they have a plethora of resources that can help families get started on their journey to incorporating mindfulness with their children.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for the recommendations.
Absolutely.
And I know that from just my own experience with mindfulness, there's also a whole bunch of apps out there. I'm sure there's information that you can find. There's probably videos online you can find, or you can go to your library and find more books, just like Ashlee was mentioning. So there's lots of resources out there, and it's good for parents as well. I know that we're dealing with our own stresses and our own anxieties. And so if we can incorporate some of this mindfulness into our own lives, then we're better able to help our kids incorporate them into their lives as well.
Absolutely. And I think from an educator's perspective, one of the things that I noticed in doing this with my children was that I was able to be a better teacher because of doing these things with my students. And I even take it home with me. I have a 3-year-old daughter, so fun times at home, but it does definitely help me be a better parent for her. And teaching her these things really help her deal with those strong emotions.
Absolutely. And what about for other teachers? Do you have other recommendations for them as far as resources or supports that they can look for if they're trying to start something like this in their classroom or in their school?
I think some of the same resources apply for teachers as well. I started with a book called Everyday SEL in the elementary school, and there's these versions of these books for pre-K, for middle school, and for high school. So no matter what level you teach, that's definitely a great resource to get started. As I mentioned before, trainings through Mindful Schools, Yoga for Classrooms, bringing in picture books are really great. Any type, there's tons of professional reading out there, mindful teaching and teaching mindfulness. But I just suggest digging into all of the resources, all of the books, listening to podcasts, and kind of putting it all together as you see fit. You can really take things whatever way you want to. But you really get a handle on things in your classroom when you start implementing it and you see the kids react and you see what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We do have a couple of last questions that I want to get in that came from our community. So we had a question about, is there a mindfulness practice that you might recommend at regular intervals of the day, such as like in the morning or right after school or before going to bed? And this parent was specifically looking for something that's quick, like 10 minutes or less. And actually, that's a question that I forgot to ask earlier. How much time would we expect like an elementary student to be able to practice a mindfulness strategy like breathing or a body scan?
Mm-hmm. So I was actually going to suggest the body scan for the practice to incorporate throughout the day. I think that's a great place to start. Is just noticing what's in different parts of your body at different times, and you can go online and find body scan scripts to lead you through that practice until you get used to it. It's something you can do sitting or lying down. Breathing exercises are always my favorite ones for especially the younger students. They really love being able to just take a breath. But going back to your other question about how much time, so you can do this in as little as 1 to 2 minutes at different intervals during the day. It doesn't have to be something that's really long. So one of the things that I like to do in my classroom, I have a choice board up that has 9 different mindful practices on it. So it could be a breathing exercise or a mindful movement pose, something as simple as giving yourself a hug or thinking about things that you're grateful for. And I have that choice board up in my room, and we'll just take a moment, 1 minute, 2 minutes, to be able to allow the students to choose one of those things to do. As I mentioned earlier, teaching mindfulness practices might take 5 or 10 minutes out of your day to teach them. But then it should be something that's incorporated throughout. So it doesn't have to be a set amount of time. But again, that can go with wherever your child or wherever your students are in their practice. I always say start small and work yourself up and then see how things go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something any of us can sit down the first time and we're going to practice for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. It's really this building process of becoming more mindful little by little.
Right. As I mentioned before, we did mindful bodies today, and it was 1 minute. And it's amazing. The kids are like, that minute seemed like a really long time. But for somebody that's just starting practice, it can be meaningful. So it doesn't have to be a lengthy process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to mention in terms of that body scan, for people who have trouble sleeping at night, I personally have used body scan a lot for trying to fall asleep at night and clear out the thoughts from the day. And that can be really effective as you practice more and more if you're having trouble sleeping or your kids are having trouble sleeping. I have another question from a parent who has a child who apparently they've been practicing mindfulness strategies with their child, But then when the child is upset, and I don't think I have an age for the kid, but when the kid gets upset, then they're refusing to use the mindfulness strategies. And so even when the parents are suggesting, oh, should we try some deep breathing or should we go for a walk? The kid is too upset to want to do any of those things. So do you have any suggestions for how to help kids be able to use these strategies in the moment when they're really feeling these strong emotions?
I think when you're in the moment and a child is refusing to do one of the activities, I think the most important thing is to calm them down or to allow them that space to calm down. And then once that's done, reinforce the practice or the breathing technique that they could have used and talk about how that could be helpful. I don't believe in pushing this on any one child or adult. So I think it's really important to give them their space to discover how it could work for them. So again, I would allow themselves to calm themselves down, however, whatever way is appropriate for them at the time, and then have that discussion afterwards. You know, how could we have used this strategy or this technique to help you in the future when this happens again or when you're feeling this certain way?
Oh, I love that. That's such a good point. And it's part of this practice, right? That it might take time for a kid or an adult to be able to use these practices when they're really upset. And it really is just this process of building on that mindfulness and talking about it afterward to think about what could I have done in that moment to help myself feel better and to use these mindfulness practices. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I do want to give you a last chance to give any advice or recommendations you have for families out there and teachers out there who are trying to implement these mindfulness practices.
I think the number one piece of advice that I could give you is to begin to cultivate your own practice while or before you're implementing this with your children. I think that when you do it yourself, you begin to see the benefits. And then you can even share and model with the children that you're working with how it works for you. Being able to talk about those things with your children, whether it be in the classroom or at home, really allows them to see the human element of yourself, and will give them something that they can relate to. And when you share what works for you, they are more likely to believe that it's going to have positive effects for them. So again, just begin to cultivate your own practice. Be patient, be open and non-judgmental, be mindful yourself, and look for all the good in what's happening.
Oh, I love that. It is so important for us to practice these things ourselves if we're expecting our kids to be able to do this as well. And as someone who practices mindfulness in my life to deal with anxiety and stress, I definitely have seen a big impact of mindfulness on my own life and how I feel from day to day. So I hope that everyone out there watching is just as excited to start their own practice and do these things with their kids and see what kind of impact it could have. If you are sitting out there and you still have questions about mindfulness, we do have some resources on Understood that you can, if you just go on understood.org and search for mindfulness, you'll be able to find some of those resources. You can also join our community to ask other families about mindfulness and see how other people are using these strategies. You can find that at u.org/community. And if you're looking for upcoming chats, we do have our next expert chat coming up on Thursday. That's going to be with Dr. Mark Griffin, who is talking about ADHD and executive functioning issues. But you can also find our full calendar of events at u.org/calendar. And on that website, you can also view previously recorded chats. You can rewatch this chat if you missed part of it or if you want to rewatch part of it. And hopefully you'll join us for some upcoming chats. Ashlee, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And thanks, everyone. Have a great day.